Hi everybody, and thank you for that very long introduction. You were very patient. It's delightful to be here in Philadelphia with a whole bunch of people who are interested in the UN. You know, that's not something that one can say in many gatherings. I know that your focus today and for the next few days is on East Asia, and it's a region that I know well, and I would be delighted to participate in your discussions on that region, but I prevailed on the organizing committee to go back to the roots of the Model UN conference and talk about the UN because the UN is facing an existential crisis. The UN may or may not survive. And the reality is that for all its good and bad effects over the last decades, we may be seeing the end game of the United Nations. In Davos, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, used an expression to describe the current international situation. And the UN is simply a symptom of the current international situation. The expression he used was the rupture. We are seeing the rupture of the existing international system. Now, I'm sure sitting in the White House, Donald Trump probably thinks of it as the rapture. But I think Mark Carney is right. We are living through the rupture of our system, and we're not sure what will replace it. One thing I've learned over the years that I've been engaged in international relations, one thing I've learned is after a crisis, you never go back to the way things were. You never simply end the crisis and return to some sort of state of normality. We always move on to a different situation. And people, your job is to help design the world situation in the post-rupture situation we find ourselves in. We need to look at what sort of world we want. Now that the world, frankly, that was designed by the United States after World War II, that's the system we live in, and that's now being ruptured by the current administration. We've got to ask ourselves what sort of world we want to live in. Thucydides wrote in the Odyssey, he wrote a passage about the dialogue between the Athenians and the Melians. It's called the Melian dialogue. And in it, the Athenians tell the Melians the reality of the situation they're in. And that situation is the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Is that the world we want to live in? Is that the world of might is right? The transactional world that is being given to us in replacing the world that was designed after World War II? I think we've got to work on this post-rupture world. And my contribution to it was the book that was mentioned. I brought it along as a prop. And that book is talking about global governance in the post-American world. The American world is the world that America designed and that America guaranteed for all those decades. That world's gone. And we've now got to work out what sort of world we want. And my argument is we've got to double down on the rules-based world. We've got to go back to the rules-based world that the Americas of the post-war era tried to design, but this time we need a far stronger UN. That's the big distinction that I'm raising in this book. So let's just quickly have a look at history. We had a League of Nations which suffers from a very poor reputation. But you know, people, the first decade of the League of Nations was a decade of unqualified success. the League of Nations did everything that its designers wanted of it. The second decade, the Great Depression, the rise of fascist powers, the League turned out to be completely impotent, and that's the reputation that it has. It was replaced by the next global institution, the United Nations. And pretty much from the outset, the second Secretary General, Doug Hammarskjöld, tried to lower our expectations of what we want from the UN when he said that the United Nations was not created to take humankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And that is, in a nutshell, the realist situation of the United Nations. Look, it has a mixed reputation. It's done quite a lot on peacekeeping, on health, on communications, even on human rights. But the reality is that the constant squabbling, especially of the major powers, has condemned it largely to paralysis on its major issue, security. So, when I was writing this book, I did the strengths and weaknesses analysis of the UN. And surprisingly, I came up with the same answer to both questions. The UN's greatest strength is its member states. They're the ones who provide the financial contributions and the peacekeepers and so forth. And its greatest weakness is the member states. Because through their constant squabbling, their incapacity to reach agreement, their inability to see the wood for the trees, to see the real problems we're facing, and finding the issues that were around 50 years ago, that's the great weakness of the UN. And I came across another realization in writing this book. The name itself of the organization is a misnomer. It does not describe what the organization is, because it's not nations that sit at Turtle Bay in the UN building, it's the governments of those nations. Totalitarian governments, authoritarian governments, military governments, narco governments, and a vanishing few democracies. That's who sit in the United Nations. They're the delegates that we have. So, I want to see a UN 3.0, a UN that will arise in the post-rupture era. And in that UN, many things have to happen, but I want to focus on just three things tonight. One, it would have to actually be a house of nations, not governments, not just governments. Nations would have to be represented at the UN. Secondly, the Secretary General and the Secretariat would have to be truly independent, not a reality that we live with today. And none of that can happen with the current situation unless we can circumscribe, limit the veto power of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So let me look at each of these issues in turn. It was way back in 1917 that Rudolf Steiner described society as the interplay of the spheres of business, government, and civil society. That's how we need to think of a nation. That's how we need to think of the representation of a nation. Government, business, and civil society. And in my view, we can actually replicate that concept at the UN. And there is a precedent for that very concept of tripartite governance of the UN, and that precedent comes from 1919, when the International Labour Organization was formed, because its membership is in equal parts governments, employers, and workers. And so the option of tripartite governance is there. What I argue is we need not one General Assembly of governments, we need 3 General Assemblies. One for the business community, one for governments, and one for civil society. the most difficult to convince people of is the business civil society, the business General Assembly. When I raise this with students, that's where I get the pushback. Corporations, and especially American corporations in the current situation, have not really done their reputation much good. But look, I'm really bolstered by an argument from a professor at Yale called Thomas Pogge, who, arguing in the field of health, wrote, "We will reach our common and imperative goal of universal access to essential medicines, either in collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry or not at all." The reality is we need to work with the business community. And in my design, I've tried to leaven the sort of profit motive that guides the business community by including the major philanthropic institutions in that assembly. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, etc. They come from the business community, but they are not driven by the profit motive. Okay. So how would these three assemblies make decisions? A simple calculation: a majority of chambers and a majority of delegates. The number of delegates in the government assembly would set the limit of the number of delegates in the business assembly and the civil society assembly. And I don't want to get technical here, but I'm going to use a word that I think most of you will understand. The two new assemblies would not be Westphalian. They would not be guided by sovereignty. There would not be one representative for each country in these assemblies. These assemblies would reflect the reality of global business and the reality of global civil society, not the artificiality of sovereignty. Hopefully in this way, we'll be able to actually make progress, because in my view, the Assembly of Civil Society will be the agenda setter, and the Business Assembly will be the enforcer. And the Government Assembly will have to just run along and catch up with us on that. So that's how we get nations at the UN, not simply governments. Let's turn to the second issue of independence of the Secretary General and the Secretariat. There's a wonderful piece of writing that you can find on the net called the UN Intellectual History Project. And in the Intellectual History Project, the authors talk about the three UNs, not historically, but the three UNs in this sense. The first UN is the UN of delegates, the UN of member states. The UN that most people think of when we talk about the UN. The second UN is the UN of secretariats, the Secretary General, the Directors General of the various agencies and their staff. And the third UN is the UN of civil society, academics and others who work with or through the UN in their everyday operations. Of course, it's the first UN that is the most powerful in the current situation. And the second UN, the UN of Secretariats, and I was part of that, as was mentioned, for 7 years, is not an admirable group of people, I'm sorry to have to say. They are completely enthralled to the delegates. They have no capacity to stand up to the delegates. And they completely lack independence, and the reason is the Secretary General lacks independence. Although, if you look at the Charter of the UN and you look at Article 99, it foresees a Secretary General with independence, with the capacity to individually bring a matter to the attention of the Security Council. So he's not just a secretary. But unfortunately, in the current situation, that's pretty much what the Secretary General has become. How could the UN and its Secretariat be independent? There's only one way, people. There's only one. It's obvious that there's only one way. The UN cannot rely on the contributions from governments. The UN must have an independent source of financing. And in 1972, James Tobin identified that source of financing. He's a Nobel winning economist. And basically, his idea was that a small uniform tax on short-term international currency conversions would fund the UN. In 2010, UNDP did a study of how much that would generate and came to the figure of $40 billion. That's with a B, $40 billion. The annual budget of the UN, by the way, pre-rupture, was $3 billion. So you can do the math. That will certainly work and will allow for a lot more to be done. So, independence is a key requirement, and of course the governments will fight tooth and nail to avoid that a UN that is independent. Will fight to be able to control the UN so that it remains the plaything of governments. And the key weapon at their disposal is the veto power of the Permanent Fund. Now, look, when we discuss this in class, I run the master's program at Rutgers. We really cannot come up with a solution to how to have an international body guarantee security on the planet. It's just not possible. We have to live with the reality that humanity will engage in violence and warfare. What we've got to do is create more and more obstacles to that and more incentives for that not to happen. But we can't click our fingers and find a new institutional design that will give us that outcome. We don't have that capacity. So the veto power of the Permanent Five is a reality that we currently live with. But way back in 1945, at the San Francisco Conference, when the Charter of the UN was drafted, a delegation had an idea of how to limit that veto. That delegation was actually the Australian delegation, led by the Foreign Minister, Doc Everett. And basically what the proposal was, okay, you're not going to have a UN without your veto, we get it, but the veto should only be for mandatory actions of the UN. Sanctions, enforcement and so forth, under Chapter 7 of the Charter. And dear members of the P5, your interests are fully protected if you have a veto against any direct mandatory action by the UN. But no other decision by the Security Council should be subject to a veto. And importantly, that includes the decision to appoint the Secretary General. Let's get rid of the P5 domination of that appointment, which is the reality we live with. And it's a reality that is not even hidden. In 1996, the United States vetoed Boutros Boutros-Ghali's second term as Secretary General. What was his crime? Independence. He showed too much independence, therefore he was vetoed. So it may not sound like earth-shattering change, but the first step is let's limit that veto so that we can actually appoint a Secretary General and let her do the job that we want a Secretary General to do in the future. let's just briefly review. Rudolf Steiner, 1917, International Labour Organization, 1919, Thomas Pogge wrote in 2008, James Tobin, 1972, Boutros Ghali vetoed in 1996, Doc Evatt made his proposal in 1945. The point I'm making is, these are not brand new ideas. These ideas have been out there. These ideas have been debated. They're not that radical. All I did in the book was put them together. But the ideas have been out there, and although I wrote this book in the first Trump term, I saw the writing on the wall then. The fact that in the first Trump administration they lost interest in world leadership meant that the world system that America designed had lost its leader even then. Now it's obvious to everyone. And I hope that in the next few days you get to talk about East Asia, but please think about the UN as well. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back again. Let's go.
Listen to you speak for 2 more hours.